Hi, this is Maddie Carroll. I'm conducting an interview with Tim Grayson here
Good morning.
for my Nursing 437 Community Partnership class, which is Rural Health with Dr. Jeannie Gottlieb. So we'll go ahead and get started. So Tim, I know you've been dealing with this for a long time, so it's going to be difficult to summarize all of it into short answer questions, but can you just start out by telling us how it all started and when you first started showing symptoms?
So it first started with my Lyme disease back in the UK, back in 1995, I think it was. I was on a camping trip with my family, and one evening I started displaying a rash, but it was an atypical rash. It wasn't centered around a bug bite or anything. It was a whole other thing we can get back to later, but over the course of a couple of days, I had the rash. I wasn't feeling great, but I wasn't feverish. I wasn't super fatigued or anything. But that was about this time of year, actually, around June. And then the following autumn, several months later, I got bronchitis in my lungs, and I had a lot of sickness from that. Was really flattened by it. Got very sick. In fact, actually, I jumped over a part. I also got appendicitis right before I got bronchitis. So I had my appendix out, and then almost like a secondary infection, I picked up the bronchitis. But I wasn't myself for months and was just really flattened, had no energy, and I was like 15, 16, so I should have been full of beans. And the symptoms to begin with were massive fatigue more than anything else. I wasn't feverish. I wasn't displaying other typical Lyme symptoms. But also Lyme is not as recognized disease as it is here. And so there was no real question of whether it could be Lyme or not at that point.
And when did you finally receive a diagnosis of Lyme?
It was a graduate, so it was like 4 or 5 years ago now. So I'd been struggling with Lyme for almost 20 years before finally getting a diagnosis.
And you were living in England at the time that you were bitten. So, and for much of your worst years. So how do you feel, if at all, that living in a country where Lyme is not as common impacted the time it took for you to get a diagnosis?
I think it was hugely impactful because, as I say, it wasn't really even considered. I certainly didn't know it would be an option. The doctors I saw were looking at my symptoms through their lens, and that's how we all look at life. And so whether or not they would have seen it, I feel like that would depend on whether or not they were a specialist in Lyme, which, as it wasn't considered from my end, I didn't request to see one. So it's kind of a trains in the night sort of thing. But because there was not the understanding of what Lyme could present as, from my perspective, certainly with my understanding, that I think would feed into not really looking for that kind of cause. And so I was given a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, which is something of an umbrella term, doesn't really explain anything. But I feel like it definitely impacted whether or not I would get an accurate diagnosis.
And how would you say that Lyme impacts your day-to-day life?
Severely, unfortunately. I'm lucky in that my symptoms are not as acute as they could be, but they are certainly chronic and have been for some time, surprisingly. But I don't suffer most of my symptoms most of the time. And most of the time I suffer some of my symptoms. And there is a small fraction of the time where I suffer a lot of symptoms. And it's more than just being tired, which is one of the most common perceptions of Lyme. It's more than just having brain fog and being slow. There's something about having symptoms like this for an extended period of time that magnifies their impact upon you. And my belief is that that's a psychological side effect, which most doctors can't really help you with. But on a day-to-day basis, I wake up feeling almost ready to go to bed. It has gotten better a lot over the years, but for a long time, I would wake up and stay in bed and then go to sleep at the end of the day. And that would be my day. And if I got up and made myself a cup of coffee, that was great. That was progress. I was effectively bedridden for 8 months, a year. And as a secondary outcome of that, muscles would atrophy, joints would seize up. I wouldn't be stimulated and active, and thankfully I didn't get bed sores, which was good, but it was incredibly limiting. And with the pain that builds up as well, both from, I don't fully understand the process of where the pain comes from. I think there's multiple angles it can come from, but it's severe enough to stop you being able to do things because your muscles feel as if you've had a ferocious workout on previous days. Like they hurt to engage and move, and your joints feel inflamed and aggravated and bruised, and that hurts to move as well. And so you have to, I found at least that I had to push through that to a certain degree just to get them moving a little, to get some circulation, to get some freedom of movement. But it's a struggle, and it causes more pain. It's like a healthy pain instead of an unhealthy one. But part of the struggle with Lyme is understanding what input has caused the symptoms you feel, if that makes sense. So I have learned that there are multiple different flavors of fatigue and of pain, and trying to figure out what's good, what's bad. Like you have to figure out how to live within the symptoms that you have rather than look to remove them all, because from my experience, that's not a short-term realistic goal. And certainly at this point with the chronic post-Lyme syndrome, I forget the precise title of it, it's more about symptom management than curing, which I found I'm becoming more and more zen about, because life is a struggle and it is hard, and there is pain and loss and difficulty for all of us. And I'm now far more empathetic about that toward others, because we all feel pain, we all get tired, and there's no way to say that I hurt more than you, if that makes sense. So it's helped me to become more understanding. It's difficult as well, because there are days when I'm less understanding because I'm simply overwhelmed and I can't reach out and support someone else because I don't have the energy for myself. So to draw it back to your original question, the symptoms affecting my everyday life, it sounds dramatic, but I'm always tired, I'm always in pain to a greater or lesser degree, but other symptoms that come up will be panic attacks and anxiety I've had over the years. I have had visual disturbances, like very large blind spots blocking my vision, so I'm unable to see much of anything or drive. I have had the loss of speech, like I'm able to think what I want to say and understand what I'm trying to communicate, but my mouth is simply on a different plane, it's on a different track, and it won't connect. And that's desperately frustrating. With the brain fog, struggling to remember words, and memory issues in general can come up as well. And there is, my understanding is there's similarity to having a stroke or having some kind of impairment, that you can see the shape of the word, you understand what it means, and you can describe it, but you can't remember what the word is, and it's maddening. I have, almost since the start of my sickness, I've had muscle spasms in my ribs, which feels like a pencil or a pen being pushed into the intercostal muscles, the muscle between your ribs, like a cramp. It's like pressure. It's very uncomfortable, and it can be a slow tensing of the muscle, and it can be a very sudden twist. It's enough to break the thread of my conversation. When I'm talking, I'll actually like jolt and grunt and so on, which is very different, of course, from like the general backache that's often there, and whether that's because I've done too much or not enough. It's difficult, and it's ever present, but it's inconsistent. And so figuring out what to do better next time is a constant struggle. But secondary to all the physical symptoms are the psychological side effects that come up from it. The questioning of self-worth. Did I somehow cause this to happen to myself? Do I deserve this? What have I done wrong? How can I do better? What's wrong with me? Why can't I go and have fun like other people? It's it can be very isolating. And part of why I'm keen to do this interview is to share with other people that there are others who are struggling too on our level, rather than just the general day-to-day, which is hard enough. So I think that covers most of it.
How old were you during the period when you were bedridden?
I would have been 16, 17.
So another follow-up question I have to that is, how would you say that Lyme disease has impacted your ability to advance through school or to work a full-time job or a part-time job even?
I had to drop out of school. In the UK, you have compulsory education to 16, and then you can choose to do 2 more years to finish high school, as it were. Or you can leave traditional schooling and join a trade school or become an apprentice, get a job. So I finished the compulsory stuff until 16, just about. That was right when I started getting sick. And then I tried to go to the extra 2 years and had to drop out by October. And so I rested up for a year and then came back and tried again and wasn't able to. And so that's when I fell out of school, and that's when I got really sick. And that's when the inability to get out of bed hit. So 17 or 18. But that then meant that I didn't have the bonding of social networks and groups and such. And I would see friends from time to time when I had the energy, when they would come to me, that kind of thing. But it was not a typical coming of age and childhood. So
no, I mean, that's a very hugely transitional stage from 15 into your 20s to be dealing with a debilitating illness.
Yes, and then I wasn't able to pursue further education, so I wasn't able to go to university either. I did eventually when I was 23. I got back into further education, but it was only part-time. It was a struggle, but it was a turning point. And so from that point, I started putting myself back together and clambering back up, but I still hadn't had a diagnosis. So in a way, there was a certain level of, this is just how I am. This is my life. This is what I have to figure out how to live with, rather than seeing that there may be a cure or help or medication.